I would like to introduce Dr. Suzanne Simard from the University of British Columbia. She's a professor and forest ecologist. She's also a pioneer on the frontier of plant communication and intelligence. Her work has influenced ecologists, filmmakers, and her TED Talks, which I've seen and they're awesome, have been viewed by more than 10 million people across the world. Dr. Simard brings us to the intimate world of trees, sharing the fascinating and really the vital truths that trees are not just simply sources of timber or pulp, but are complicated, interdependent circles of life. And they are really the backbone of forest ecosystems. They're social, they're cooperative creatures that are connected through underground networks, which was fascinating to learn about because it shows that they're communities just like we are. They have vitality, they have friends, they have vulnerabilities, and their communal lives are ultimately not that different than our own. Dr. Simard's first book just came out. It's called Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. It's based on her more than 30 years of studying relationships between trees and their ecosystems and how they're all connected as a society in the forest. I would encourage everyone to check it out. And if I'm not mistaken, there should be a film adaptation of that in the works starring Amy Adams. So congratulations, that's wonderful. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. What an incredible forum here. I love Blair's talk. I love Sonia's talk. I love what everybody is saying. And I hope I can contribute, my perspective. And I think that it dovetails with what everyone is saying. So I actually prepared some slides, but I'm just going to speak. So I'm actually in Nelson, British Columbia right now. This is where I live. I'm on the unceded territory of the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Okanagan nations. I actually grew up in Kamloops. I went to school there, which is in the unceded territory of the Secwepemc Nation. And I lived across the river from that residential school. And it's heartbreaking. And I feel ashamed, to be honest. I come from a French Canadian family. We emigrated from France, emigrated across Canada, and settled in the Enderby area, which was in the Splatsin Nation, which is part of the Secwepemc, a tribe within the Secwepemc. And I was a kid when that residential school was operating. It closed in 1969 as an overnight residential school. So I was 9 years old when it closed. But I remember, there were First Nations kids in my school. But of course, First Nations kids went to that other school as well. And we didn't know much about it, except that I remember, and I'm just telling you this from my heart, my sister Robin had friends in the school. I didn't. And she came home one night, she went over and stayed overnight. And she said, "Mom, all those kids were crying." And we still were so ignorant, And so here it was, happening right with us. And we didn't learn about it in school. It was removed from us, even though it was all happening right underneath our very lives. And I hope that we've learned. I hope we learn from this experience. I hope we move forward. I hope we create a better reality for everybody that's inclusive of all communities of faith, all communities of color, all communities of nations. Because the painful past is really hard to live through, and it's really hard to move forward, but we have to. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my story. That is a really painful thing for me to come to terms with. My family, as I said, settled in the Splatsin Nation area. We were French Canadian, even though I grew up in Kamloops. But I spent all my summers at this place that was in the Splatsin Nation territory. And my family, as with many colonist family, were given land along the Shuswap River, which is now called the Shuswap River. And all the Splatsin Nation people were moved onto a 200-acre piece of land, a reserve, to provide homesteads for European families. And I don't think that my French Canadian family came to terms with that They certainly didn't talk about it. We certainly never talked about it. But my family were horse loggers, and so they logged in this area. And prior to, the nations were around. They fished from the Shuswap River. They had weirs. I didn't see them, but those weirs were for fishing for salmon. They were very special fishing technologies. Those weirs were set up, in rivers throughout British Columbia, because British Columbia when I grew up, it was a province of old growth forests and salmon rivers. Now it's a province of clear cuts and rivers that have very little salmon left in them. And it's because we basically outlawed those amazing fishing technologies. The weirs, where they could count the fish and then adapt if there weren't good migrations that year, reduce the harvest. There were, in the Fraser River, it wasn't weirs, but they used spears and dip nets to fish for the salmon, to just, take what they needed. And I remember, working, I got a job later when I was a young forester, and the First Nations and I worked in Lillooet, and they were harvesting salmon. And I remember them drying the salmon along the river, but I still didn't really know much. And then I eventually, became a forester, and I witnessed what was so different than what my family did. My family were horse loggers, so they just took the odd tree here and there. But they were really the beginning, right? They were, even though my great grandfather, my grandfather, my uncles, my dad, they weren't exploiting the forest, at least not from my eye. They were taking out the odd white pine and the odd cedar. But then when I became a forester, I entered into this era of rampant clear cutting. The exploitation was astounding. I was only in my early 20s, but I grew up in the forest, in intact rainforests. And what I saw was a destruction of those rainforests and replacing them with plantations that were sick. They were getting sicker all the time, because not only were we taking these old forests, or, this colonist attitude of exploitation, taking these old growth forests, but we were replacing them with these simplified, purified, cleansed plantations, free of native plants, just like our society was trying to free itself of the native children. It's the same thing. You're right, Sonia. It's the same thing. And I was so fortunate that, even though I wasn't working with First Nations people at the time, I knew in my heart that this was wrong, right? That we were disconnecting the land, and it was a connected place. I knew that in my heart. I think we all know that. And so I started studying connections in forests to try to figure out what the heck are we doing wrong. And eventually, and that's when I learned about these below ground webs, right? That the fungi that linked the forest together. And it just made sense to me, because the forest is a place where there's so much going on. It's so sophisticated. It's not just about competing and dominating and being the winner. It's about collaborating and working together and facilitating each other and being companions and being resilient, because we all work together and our network together. The forest does that, right? Just like our own communities need to do that. And eventually, I published this work in the journal Nature, but there was this huge backlash, because, like, as Sonia talked about, there is this huge infrastructure already in place to hold those pillars of discrimination, of exploitation in place to favor a few. It's really hard to break those policies and laws, because they're so solid, they're so entrenched. There's whole economies built around them to sustain those things. And so when I brought out my work and said, it's not just about, getting rid of plants you don't want, we need the whole forest to go through its natural successional process, I couldn't break those policies by myself. And so there was a huge backlash. And eventually I left the ministry. I was working for the Ministry of Forests, so I know how government works. And I went into academia, and I was able to pursue my research. And eventually I got to work with some First Nations people. And my whole world opened up, even though I'd been trying to understand, and trying to convey to my colleagues, to the people that were running the forest, to the industry, the government, that we were disconnecting the forest to our detriment, that it was actually ripping these forests apart and it was ripping us apart, that we were losing biodiversity and carbon and clean water and our air. And, we were on this downward spiral where we should have been on an upward spiral, right? Where we're meant to soar. And yet we were falling, and we still are. But I know that there's a way out of this. And so let me talk about that a little bit. So I started working with a First Nations woman who I work with a lot now. Her name is Dr. Teresa Ryan, Simhayex. She's Tsimshian Nation, and she's a salmon fishery scientist. And she told me the stories of in her villages in the Tsimshian Nation, of which there are many tribes, 6, I think, that the Tlingit, the Kaida, the Haltsik, the Kwakwak, they use what were called tidal stone traps to fish for salmon. So they're all salmon communities. They depend on salmon. They call themselves people of the salmon or people of the cedar. The salmon, the forest are all intimately linked together. And she has taught me about these tidal stone traps and how they're all along our coastline. Most people don't know about them, but to me, they're like the 8th wonder of the world. When you look at them from satellite imagery, there are these beautiful contours along our coastline that the First Nations built over thousands of years. And the way they worked is that on the ebb tide, the salmon would get trapped behind these stone walls that they had built over thousands of years. They would get trapped behind them, and they would passively fish for some of the salmon for their food. But they always threw the big mothers back. And they threw the big mothers back into the ocean so that they could produce eggs for bigger babies. And that would keep the population strong and alive and thriving. And they kept track, right? They kept track of the variability. And so when the salmon populations were low, when the runs were low, they didn't fish as much. And they would always let the big mothers go up and spawn in the fall. And so they were very much attuned and built up those salmon populations through their ingenious indigenous science. And when the salmon went to spawn, the bears and the eagles and the wolves and the cougars would pick up some of those salmon, the ravens, and take them into the forest. And they would eat some of them under these big old trees, what I'm calling mother trees, what they call grandmother trees, which the Shepwamek, Mary Thomas of the Shepwamek Nation, called the mother trees. And the salmon decay, and then the nitrogen in that salmon ends up being picked up by these mycorrhizal networks, which I studied so much, these connections that connect all trees together. And that salmon is picked up by these fungi and it ends up in the trees, right? It ends up in the trees. The actual nitrogen of the salmon is in the tree rings for thousands and thousands of years. And we can actually reconstruct salmon population densities by looking at the nitrogen N15 in those tree rings. And my guess is that, and we haven't done this, but we want to do this, is that when colonization happened and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans took over that salmon fishery, took that resource away from the First Nations, and they dismantled those and outlawed those ancient tidal stone traps and said, we're going to do it ourselves. And look what has happened to our salmon populations since then. They've gone like this, right? And what we're trying to do is go back and say, let's reconstruct those old technologies. Let's bring them back. Let's watch what happens to those resources when we manage them with respect. When we don't take everything. We don't take every tree. We don't take every salmon. We don't take every bear. We just take what we need with respect. And so I learned this in a much deeper way just from my own Western science. I learned it through Indigenous eyes, because now I'm working almost a lot with a lot of different First Nations. And this is how they honor the land, as though they're one with it, right? And there's many words and all these nations that say we are one. Netsamatst is one of the Coast Salish words. And so we have this in us. Like Sonia said, it's in our DNA to know this stuff, that we are all connected together, that we are just part of nature. I don't believe that man is the dominion over nature. I believe that man is one with nature, that the trees are our brothers and sisters, as are the wolves and the bears, and we need to treat them with equal respect, just like we do with each other. And it's through these webs of resilience that is how we are wired to heal, how we are wired to thrive, and we just need to reconnect ourselves with each other, with the forest, and we will. I believe that we have it in us to recover and find a better way. I've seen it. I see it in the First Nations. I know that nature is wired that way. I think we can do it. So with that, thank you so much for having me, and it's an honor, so much an honor to be here. Thank you.